Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Science. Tonight, we're exploring a fascinating question. What if Leonardo da Vinci, the famous artist and inventor from the 1400s, had access to all of modern science? What if he could sit in his workshop and learn about atoms, DNA, black holes, and quantum mechanics? It's an interesting question because it makes us think about how observation works, how curiosity drives discovery, and how tools can expand what humans can understand. We're going to move slowly, talking about what Leonardo knew back then and what modern science has discovered since. Picture Leonardo opening a strange glowing device and asking, "What wonders does the universe hold that I haven't seen yet?" Let's picture Leonardo's workshop in Italy. More than 500 years ago, historians studying Renaissance Florence have found that workshops like his were typically small rooms with stone walls. The only light came from candles and sunlight filtering through small windows. Outside, the cities of Florence was waking up. Horses clomped on cobblestones. People called to each other in Italian. The world was smaller then, measured in days of travel, not seconds of communication. Archaeologists have examined surviving notebooks from this period. On a wooden table sat a leather-bound notebook, a bottle of ink, and several quills. This was powerful technology for Leonardo. It let him capture what he saw, what he imagined, what he wondered about. According to art historians, Leonardo created over 13,000 pages of notes and drawings during his lifetime. A drawing he made today could be studied by someone else years from now, or even centuries later. For him, this was already like magic. When you take a photo with your phone, you're doing something similar. You're freezing a moment in time, capturing light and shape and color. The tools are different, but the basic idea is the same. Your eyes see something. Your brain processes it. Your fingers press a button. It feels simple, but it's actually one of the most complex things the universe has ever done. Now imagine that on Leonardo's table, next to his notebooks, there's also a small glowing screen. It shows moving images, diagrams that shift and change, text that scrolls endlessly. Leonardo doesn't know what a computer is. He doesn't know what the internet is. He only knows that when he touches this screen, it shows him knowledge from places and times he's never seen. To him, this would feel like having access to every library in the world, every scientist's notes, every discovery that's ever been made. To us, we'd call it modern science. All of it compressed into a device he can hold. Not magic, not a miracle, but the accumulated work of millions of minds over hundreds of years. All of it available in an instant. Inside that glowing screen, there are no quills. There are no handwritten notes in Italian. Instead, there are images from electron microscopes showing atoms. There are photos from space telescopes showing galaxies. There are animations of DNA spiraling, of cells dividing, of planets orbiting. There are equations that describe forces and energies Leonardo could only guess at. You have access to all of this right now. Every day you can learn about discoveries that would have amazed Leonardo. You can see images of things too small for any human eye, too large for any human mind to fully grasp. You can watch videos of experiments that took decades to design. For you, this is normal. For Leonardo, it would have been like opening a door to another universe. So when Leonardo slowly reaches toward this strange screen and touches an icon labeled anatomy, what happens next is that his world of careful observation meets our world of detailed imaging. He sees X-rays of bones. He sees MRI scans of brains. He sees 3D models of organs rotating in space. He sees animations of blood flowing through vessels he drew by hand, now moving in real time. If you could step into Leonardo's mind in that moment, you'd find a storm of connections happening. Billions of neurons, like tiny trees, sending electrical signals down their branches. Regions of his brain for visual processing light up with activity. There's an area that recognizes faces, another that processes motion, another that understands spatial relationships. All of these regions work together when he looks at something new. When he sees a modern diagram of the human heart, his visual cortex turns patterns of light into shapes he recognizes. His memory systems compare this to the hearts he dissected himself, the ones he drew in his notebooks. Tiny judgment circuits in his frontal lobes notice the differences, the details he missed, the structures he couldn't see with his eyes alone. He might smile. He might frown in concentration. Either way, he's not just receiving information. He's comparing it to everything he already knows. Neuroscientists have studied how brains process new information. Research shows that when you learn something new, your brain compares it to what you already know. Every fact you encounter becomes raw material that your brain can accept, reshape, or quietly reject. Scientists call this schema building. Your brain organizes new information into patterns you already understand. When new information fits your patterns, processing feels smooth. When it doesn't, your attention activates more strongly. So if Leonardo saw a diagram showing that atoms are mostly empty space, with tiny nuclei and electrons whirling around them, his brain might struggle at first. He has no framework for this. He has never seen an atom. He has never imagined matter as mostly void. The idea does not fit the patterns he built from observing the world with his eyes and hands. This is one small way that tools and knowledge shape understanding. We can only truly grasp concepts we have ways to observe or measure. You understand atoms because you have seen models, animations, and explanations built up over years of education. Leonardo understood water and air and earth because he could see them, touch them, watch them move. His knowledge grew from direct observation. Modern knowledge often grows from instruments that extend our senses far beyond what our bodies can perceive. If Leonardo really did have access to modern science, the first quiet change would be scale. Today, we can see things smaller than a grain of sand and larger than our entire galaxy. In Leonardo's time, the smallest thing he could observe was what his eyes could see, maybe with the help of a simple magnifying glass. The largest thing was the sky above, the stars he could count on a clear night. Scale matters because it changes what questions you can even ask. When you can see individual cells dividing, you can ask how life begins. When you can see galaxies colliding, you can ask how the universe formed. When you can see atoms arranging themselves, you can ask how materials get their properties. Your curiosity expands to match what you can observe. This can feel like magic, but underneath it is technology. Microscopes extend our vision downward. Telescopes extend our vision upward. Particle accelerators let us probe the structure of matter itself. Each tool opens new layers of reality that were always there, but invisible to unaided human senses. Your brain works like an observation machine. Over years, it watches and listens and remembers patterns in the world. You learn what a tree looks like, what a bird sounds like, what rain feels like. You may not know the scientific names, but you recognize the patterns. When you see something new, you compare it to these stored patterns. So in that candlelit workshop, if Leonardo opens a page about quantum mechanics, he is not just reading words. He is trying to fit impossible ideas into a mind built for observing falling water and flying birds. He can read the equations. His intuition, trained over years of careful observation, will quietly say, "This does not match what I have seen," to some ideas, and "this makes sense" to others. Modern science offers concepts. The human mind chooses which ones to accept, which ones to question, which ones to set aside for later. This is one important difference between information and understanding. Information can be transmitted instantly. Understanding takes time. It requires building new mental models, new ways of seeing the world. Leonardo's choices would be shaped not only by what sounds logical, but by what fits with his lifetime of direct observation, his deep trust in what his eyes and hands could tell him. Now let your mind drift for a moment to Leonardo's notebooks. Pages filled with sketches of machines, studies of water, drawings of muscles and bones. His handwriting flows in mirror script, written backward, perhaps to keep his ideas private, or perhaps just because it felt natural to his left hand. Each page is a record of curiosity, of questions asked and partially answered. If Leonardo had a device that could show him modern engineering, he would still face the same old problem. Do these designs work when built in the real world? Ideas on paper are one thing. Ideas made into physical objects are another. Your own brain treats imagined objects and real ones a little differently. When you imagine a machine, your visual system works. When you build that machine, your motor system, your sense of touch, your understanding of materials all join in. You are not just thinking, you are doing. Engineers experience this even more intensely. They must think about how materials bend, how forces distribute, how heat flows, how things break. Leonardo's designs, like his flying machines, show he understood some of these principles intuitively. But he did not have the mathematical tools to calculate stresses, the material science to predict failures, or the testing methods to verify his ideas safely. A modern computer simulation does not have a body to feel these forces. It can calculate them because it has been programmed with equations that describe how materials behave. But it does not get tired. It does not feel the weight of a lever. So if Leonardo used modern engineering software to design a bridge, he would still need to build a model, test it, and feel how it responds to load. His senses would tell him if the design felt right, even if the math said it should work. Engineers test their designs in the real world. They build models. They measure forces. They observe how materials actually behave. Leonardo would have done the same, even with modern tools. Let us move a little higher, into a balcony, looking down at history. Tools for observation have changed many times. For most of human existence, knowledge came only from what people could see hear, touch, taste, and smell directly. They sat around fires. They told stories about what they observed. If no one saw something happen, it was hard to verify. Then came writing, which let observations be recorded and shared. Then came instruments like the telescope and microscope, which extended human senses. For Leonardo, having a magnifying glass was a leap. It let him see details in plants, in fabrics, in the structure of materials that his naked eye could not resolve. The telescope did something quiet and powerful to human understanding. It allowed people to see that the moon had mountains, that Jupiter had moons, that the universe was far larger than anyone imagined. A scientist could point a telescope at the sky and see things that challenged ancient beliefs. Another scientist, years later, could point a better telescope at the same spot and see even more. Knowledge began to stack like bricks, one observation on another, building tall towers of understanding. Today we have instruments that extend our senses in ways Leonardo could not have imagined. Electron microscopes that see individual atoms, radio telescopes that detect signals from the early universe, gravitational wave detectors that feel ripples in space-time itself. Each new instrument opens a new window into reality. If Leonardo had access to all of these, he might ask to see the smallest things first. He was fascinated by water, by how it flowed, by the patterns it made. What would he think of seeing individual water molecules, of watching them bond and break apart? He might spend hours just watching animations of molecular motion, comparing them to the flowing streams he observed in nature. His notebooks show he was interested in flight, in how birds moved through air. What would he think of seeing simulations of airflow around wings, of pressure distributions, of turbulence patterns? He might recognize some patterns from his observations, but others would be completely new, revealing forces and flows invisible to the human eye. His anatomical drawings are famous for their accuracy and detail. What would he think of seeing MRI scans, of 3D reconstructions of organs, of real-time videos of blood flow? He might compare these to his own dissections, noticing what he got right and what he missed. He might feel a mix of pride in his careful work and wonder at how much more there is to see. But what did Leonardo actually know about science? What did people in his time understand about the world? Let us drift for a moment into the scientific landscape of late 1400s and early 1500s Italy. It was a time of rediscovery, of ancient knowledge meeting new observations. In Leonardo's Italy, most people still believed ideas from ancient Greek and Roman texts. The Earth sat at the center of the universe. The human body was governed by 4 humors that needed balancing. Matter consisted of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. These ideas had been passed down for more than 1,000 years. But even in Leonardo's lifetime, some thinkers started questioning these old beliefs. They made new observations that didn't fit the ancient explanations. They dissected human bodies and found structures the old texts didn't describe. They studied motion and found patterns the old theories couldn't explain. Leonardo himself was part of this shift. He didn't just read what others had written. He looked for himself. He dissected bodies, studied plants, observed water, watched birds fly. He trusted his eyes more than ancient authority. This was revolutionary at the time. Most knowledge still came from books, from authorities, from tradition. Questioning authority was risky. It could lead to accusations of heresy or disrespect. But Leonardo was willing to look, to draw what he saw, to record his observations, even when they contradicted what everyone believed. Art historians, studying Leonardo's notebooks, have found that many of his observations were remarkably accurate. According to research published in medical journals, his drawings of the human heart show structures that match modern anatomy with surprising precision. His studies of water flow show patterns that match what we calculate with fluid dynamics equations. His observations about light and shadow demonstrate understanding of principles we now explain with optics. But he was limited by the tools of his time. He could only see what his eyes could resolve. He could only measure what he could compare to known objects. He could only test ideas that he could build with available materials. If Leonardo had asked a modern science database about anatomy, it would explain cells, DNA, proteins, and the molecular machinery of life. It would tell him that the heart is not just a pump, but a complex organ with specialized cells that generate electrical signals. It would describe how blood carries oxygen bound to hemoglobin, how the immune system recognizes invaders, how nerves transmit signals using chemical and electrical processes. These facts would have amazed him. They would have answered questions he could only guess at, but they might also have frustrated him because they describe a level of detail he could never observe directly. No matter how carefully he looked, the study of motion and mechanics in Leonardo's time was mostly based on observation and intuition. People knew that objects fell when dropped. They knew that heavier objects seemed to fall faster, though this wasn't quite true. They knew that you could use levers to lift heavy things, that wheels made movement easier, that water flowed downhill. But they didn't have a unified theory of motion. They didn't understand gravity as a force that acts on all objects equally. They didn't have equations that could predict how fast something would fall, how far a projectile would travel, or how much force a machine could produce. Leonardo studied motion carefully. Historians have cataloged his notebooks and found hundreds of sketches of falling objects, of mechanisms, of ways to convert one kind of motion into another. He understood that you could use gears to change speed and direction. He understood that you could use pulleys to multiply force. He understood principles of mechanical advantage that we still use today. But he was working from observation and intuition, not from mathematical laws. He could see that a lever worked, but he might not have been able to calculate exactly how much weight it could lift. He could see that water flowed, but he couldn't predict exactly how fast it would move through a pipe of a given size. Modern physics has developed precise equations for all of these things. We can calculate the trajectory of a projectile, the flow rate of water through a pipe, the mechanical advantage of any lever system. We understand that these all follow from a few fundamental laws. Newton's laws of motion, the laws of thermodynamics, the principles of conservation of energy and momentum. If Leonardo had asked a modern physics database about motion, it would explain these laws, show him the equations, and provide simulations of how objects move under different conditions. He might recognize some patterns from his observations. A falling object does accelerate. A lever does multiply force. But the precision, the ability to calculate exact outcomes, would be new. He might also struggle with some concepts. The idea that all objects fall at the same rate in a vacuum, regardless of weight, contradicts what he would have observed in everyday life. A feather falls slower than a stone because of air resistance, not because of different gravitational forces. But without the ability to create a vacuum, Leonardo could never have observed this directly. The idea that motion and rest are relative, that there is no absolute frame of reference, might also be hard for him to accept. His observations were always from his own perspective, from the ground, from a fixed point. The concept that the Earth itself is moving, rotating, and orbiting would challenge his direct experience of standing on solid, unmoving ground. The understanding of light and vision in Leonardo's time was based on ancient ideas mixed with new observations. Most scholars still believe that vision worked by something coming out of the eyes, reaching out to touch objects, and then returning with information. This theory came from Greek philosophers. It felt intuitive. When you look at something, it feels like your gaze is reaching out toward it. But Leonardo was starting to question this. He studied how light behaved when it hit different surfaces. He observed shadows, reflections, and the way light seemed to bend when it passed through water or glass. He understood that you needed light to see, that objects did not emit their own visual rays. His notebooks contain careful studies of light and shadow, of how perspective works, of how to represent three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional surface. These studies helped him become a master painter, able to create images that looked convincingly real. But he did not understand the wave nature of light, or that different colors correspond to different wavelengths. He did not know that light travels at a finite speed, so fast that it seems instantaneous over everyday distances. He did not understand how the eye actually works, how lenses focus light, how photoreceptor cells convert light into electrical signals. Modern physics has discovered that light behaves in ways that would have seemed magical to Leonardo. It is both a wave and a particle. It travels at a constant speed through empty space, about 300,000 kilometers per second. It can be bent by gravity, split into colors by prisms, or turned into electricity by solar panels. If Leonardo had asked a modern science database about light, it would explain electromagnetic waves, photons, the speed of light, and quantum mechanics. It would describe how light interacts with matter, how colors are created, how vision actually works in the eye and brain. This knowledge would have answered questions that people in Leonardo's time could not even ask properly, because they did not have the right concepts or tools. But it might also have taken away some of the mystery and wonder that made light so fascinating to study. Leonardo's approach was to observe carefully and record what he saw. Modern science often requires instruments that extend beyond human senses and theories that describe things that cannot be directly observed. Both approaches are valid, but they feel different. One is grounded in direct experience. The other is grounded in mathematical models and experimental verification. The study of the human body in Leonardo's time was a mix of ancient medical texts and new anatomical observations. Most doctors still followed ideas from ancient Greek and Roman physicians. They believed the body was made of 4 humors that needed to be balanced. When these humors were out of balance, you got sick. But some anatomists were starting to look at real human bodies more carefully. Dissection was becoming more accepted, though it was still controversial and often done in secret. Leonardo himself dissected many bodies, studying muscles, bones, organs, and how they connected. His anatomical drawings are famous for their accuracy and detail. He drew the human skeleton from multiple angles. He drew muscles with their attachments and functions. He drew the heart, the brain, the eye, trying to understand how each part worked. But he was limited by what he could see with his eyes and simple magnifying glasses. He could not see individual cells. He could not see the structure of tissues at a microscopic level. He could not understand how organs functioned at a biochemical level. Modern biology has tools that extend vision far beyond what Leonardo could achieve. Light microscopes can see individual cells. Electron microscopes can see the structures inside cells. We can use dyes and markers to highlight specific molecules. We can watch cells divide, move, and interact in real time. If Leonardo had asked a modern biology database about the human body, it would explain cells, DNA, proteins, and the molecular machinery that makes life possible. It would show him that every cell contains a complete copy of the genetic code. It would describe how cells communicate using chemical signals. It would explain how the immune system recognizes and fights invaders. This knowledge would have transformed his understanding. He might have realized that the body is not just a collection of organs, but a complex system of interacting cells, each following instructions encoded in DNA. He might have seen connections between his observations and the underlying molecular processes, but he might also have felt overwhelmed. The level of detail, the complexity, the number of different processes all happening simultaneously might have been too much to take in at once. His approach was to focus on one thing at a time, to observe it carefully, to understand it deeply before moving on. Modern science often requires understanding many interconnected systems at once. Mathematics in Leonardo's time was mostly practical. Artists needed geometry to create perspective in paintings. Engineers needed arithmetic to calculate forces and distances. Merchants needed math to track money and goods. But abstract mathematics, the kind that explores patterns for their own sake, was still developing. Algebra was in its early stages. Calculus would not be invented until after Leonardo's death. Statistics, probability theory, and many other branches of mathematics did not exist yet. Leonardo used mathematics in his work. He calculated proportions for his paintings. He used geometry to create accurate perspective. He estimated forces and distances for his engineering designs. But he did not have the mathematical tools to describe many of the phenomena he observed. He could see that water flowed in certain patterns, but he could not write equations that would predict those patterns. He could see that objects moved in certain ways, but he did not have the calculus needed to describe acceleration or changing forces. Modern mathematics has developed tools that can describe almost any pattern or process. Calculus can describe rates of change. Statistics can find patterns in data. Linear algebra can solve systems of equations with many variables. These tools let scientists build models that can predict how systems will behave. If Leonardo had asked a modern mathematics database about the patterns he observed, it might show him equations that describe fluid flow, or statistical methods for analyzing data, or geometric tools for understanding complex shapes. He might have been fascinated by these tools. He loved patterns, loved finding order in what seemed chaotic. Mathematical descriptions might have given him new ways to understand and communicate the patterns he saw. But he might also have preferred his visual, intuitive approach. His notebooks are full of drawings, not equations. He thought in images, in shapes, in relationships he could see and draw. Mathematical abstraction might have felt less real to him than a careful sketch. Chemistry in Leonardo's time was still mostly alchemy. Alchemists tried to turn base metals into gold. They searched for an elixir that would grant eternal life. They believed that all matter was made of combinations of a few basic elements. Most alchemists never succeeded in their goals, but their experiments led to real discoveries. They learned how to purify metals, how to make dyes and medicines, how to create new materials. Leonardo was interested in materials. He studied how different substances behaved. He experimented with paints, trying to find colors that would last. He observed how metals changed when heated, how water could dissolve some things but not others. But he did not understand atomic structure. He did not know that matter is made of atoms, that atoms combine to form molecules, that chemical reactions involve rearranging these atoms. He could observe that mixing certain substances created new substances, but he could not explain why. Modern chemistry has discovered the atomic structure of matter. We know that everything is made of atoms, that there are about 100 different types of atoms called elements, that these can combine in countless ways to form molecules. We understand how chemical bonds work, how reactions proceed, how to predict what will happen when you mix different substances. If Leonardo had asked a modern chemistry database about the materials he worked with, it would explain their atomic structure, how they form, and why they have the properties they do. It would show him that gold is gold because of how its atoms are arranged, that water can dissolve salt because of how the molecules interact. This knowledge would have transformed his understanding of materials. He might have realized that the properties of substances come from their underlying structure, not from mystical essences or humors. He might have seen new possibilities for creating materials with specific properties. But he might also have missed the hands-on experimentation. Modern chemistry often involves working with equations and models, not just mixing things and seeing what happens. Leonardo's approach was more experimental, more tactile. He learned by doing, by observing, by trying things and seeing the results. The study of astronomy in Leonardo's time was still based on ancient Greek models. Most people believed the Earth sat at the center of the universe. The sun, moon, and planets all circled around us in perfect spheres. This idea came from Ptolemy, an ancient astronomer whose work had been preserved and studied for over 1,000 years. But even in Leonardo's lifetime, some astronomers were starting to question this model. They noticed that the planets did not move in perfectly regular circles. Sometimes they appeared to move backward against the stars, a phenomenon called retrograde motion. The old model explained this with complex circles within circles. But it was getting complicated. Leonardo was interested in the sky, but he was more focused on what he could observe directly on Earth. He studied how light moved, how shadows formed, how perspective worked. These observations helped him paint, but they also revealed patterns in how the physical world behaved. If Leonardo had asked a modern astronomy database about the universe, it would explain that the Earth orbits the Sun, not the other way around. It would describe stars as distant suns, some larger and hotter than our own. It would explain that galaxies contain billions of stars, that the universe is expanding, that it began in a Big Bang about 13.8 billion years ago. These facts would have shocked him. They would have challenged everything his culture believed about humanity's place in the cosmos. But they might also have given him new ways to think about scale, about distance, about the relationship between the small and the large. Leonardo was fascinated by patterns that repeated at different scales. He noticed how tree branches mirrored the shape of rivers. He saw how muscles attached to bones in ways that optimized force. Modern science has discovered that many patterns do repeat across scales, from the quantum to the cosmic. Fractals, self-similar structures, appear in everything from coastlines to galaxies. If he had seen images of spiral galaxies, he might have recognized something familiar. The same spiral pattern appears in seashells, in the way water drains, in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. Nature uses similar solutions to similar problems, whether at the scale of a plant or a galaxy. The understanding of geology in Leonardo's time was mostly based on observation and ancient texts. People noticed that rocks came in different types, that some layers seemed to stack on top of others, that fossils sometimes appeared in stone. But they did not have a systematic way to understand how the Earth's surface had changed over time. Leonardo observed geological features carefully. He noticed that rivers carved valleys, that mountains showed layers of different rock types, that fossils of sea creatures sometimes appeared far from the ocean. He wondered how these things could be, but he didn't have the concepts of plate tectonics or deep time to explain them. Geologists today use radiometric dating to determine the age of rocks. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, far older than anyone in Leonardo's time imagined. Scientists have found evidence that continents drift on tectonic plates, moving at about the speed your fingernails grow. Mountains rise and erode over millions of years. Fossils tell the story of life evolving over hundreds of millions of years. According to geological surveys, the Alps near where Leonardo lived began forming about 65 million years ago when the African plate collided with the European plate. If Leonardo had asked a modern geology database about the Earth, it would explain plate tectonics, the rock cycle, geological timescales, and how the Earth formed. It would describe how scientists can read the history of the planet in layers of rock, how they can reconstruct ancient environments, how they can predict future geological events. This knowledge would have transformed his understanding of the landscape he painted. Those mountains in the background of his paintings were not always there. They rose over millions of years, pushed up by colliding continents. They will erode away over millions more years. Their material carried to the sea to form new rocks. Leonardo loved to paint landscapes, to capture the beauty of nature. But he might have found even more beauty in understanding the deep processes that shaped those landscapes. The slow dance of rock and water and time that created every valley and peak. The study of botany in Leonardo's time was mostly about identifying useful plants. People knew which plants were good for food, which could be used for medicine, which were poisonous. They passed this knowledge down through generations, but they did not have a scientific understanding of how plants worked. Leonardo was fascinated by plants. Botanists studying his notebooks have cataloged over 180 different plant species he drew. He observed how branches grew, how leaves arranged themselves to catch sunlight, how roots spread through soil. He noticed patterns in plant growth that we now explain with mathematical models called phyllotaxis. He didn't understand photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight into energy. Research shows that a single tree can produce enough oxygen in one day for 2 people to breathe. He didn't know that plants exchange gases with the atmosphere, taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. He didn't understand how plants reproduce, how seeds contain genetic information that determines what the new plant will be like. Modern genetics has found that plants share about 25% of their DNA with humans, showing how all life is connected. Modern biology has discovered the molecular machinery of plant life. We understand how chlorophyll captures light energy. We know how plants transport water from roots to leaves. We can explain why leaves are green, why flowers have certain shapes, why some plants grow tall while others stay close to the ground. If Leonardo had asked a modern biology database about plants, it would explain cells, photosynthesis, genetics, and the evolutionary relationships between different species. It would show him that all plants share a common ancestor, that they have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to fill different ecological niches. This knowledge would have deepened his appreciation for the plants he painted. That leaf he drew so carefully is not just a shape. It is a solar panel, a factory, a complex system for capturing energy and building the materials of life. Every detail he observed serves a purpose, shaped by millions of years of evolution. Leonardo's botanical drawings are beautiful because they capture the form of plants accurately. But they might have been even more meaningful if he had understood the function behind those forms, the deep reasons why nature shaped them that way. The understanding of animal behavior in Leonardo's time was mostly based on observation and folklore. People noticed how animals moved, how they hunted, how they interacted with each other. But they did not have scientific theories to explain why animals behaved the way they did. Leonardo was particularly fascinated by birds. His notebooks are full of studies of bird flight, of wing shapes, of how birds moved through air. He designed flying machines based on his observations of birds, trying to understand the principles that allowed them to fly. He did not understand aerodynamics, the science of how objects move through air. He did not know about lift, drag, thrust, and weight, the 4 forces that govern flight. He could observe that birds flapped their wings, but he did not understand the complex interactions between wing shape, air pressure, and motion. Modern physics and biology have discovered the principles of flight in detail. We can calculate how much lift a wing will generate. We understand how birds use different flight techniques for different situations. We know how muscles power flight, how bones are structured to be strong but light. If Leonardo had asked a modern science database about flight, it would explain aerodynamics, biomechanics, and the evolutionary adaptations that allow birds to fly. It would show him simulations of airflow around wings, calculations of forces, and comparisons between different flying animals. This knowledge would have helped him understand why his flying machines would not have worked as designed. Human muscles are not strong enough. Human bones are too heavy. The principles he observed were correct, but applying them to human flight requires different solutions than nature evolved for birds. But he might also have been inspired to think about new possibilities. Modern aircraft use engines instead of muscles, materials lighter and stronger than bone. They follow the same aerodynamic principles Leonardo observed in birds, but implement them in ways he could not have imagined. Leonardo's fascination with flight was ahead of its time. It would be centuries before humans achieved powered flight, but his observations laid groundwork for understanding the principles that would eventually make it possible. The study of water in Leonardo's time was mostly practical. People needed to understand water to build canals, to design fountains, to predict floods. They observed how water flowed, how it behaved in different situations, but they did not have mathematical equations to describe it precisely. Leonardo was obsessed with water. His notebooks contain hundreds of studies of water in motion. He drew waves, eddies, vortices, the way water flowed around obstacles. He observed how water moved in rivers, how it fell from heights, how it collected in pools. He understood some principles intuitively. He knew that water seeks its own level. He understood that flowing water has energy that can be harnessed. He observed patterns in water flow that we now explain with fluid dynamics. But he did not have the mathematical tools to calculate flow rates, to predict turbulence, to design systems that would control water precisely. He could see that water behaved in certain ways, but he could not write equations that would let him predict exactly how it would behave in new situations. Modern fluid dynamics has developed equations that can describe almost any water flow. We can calculate how fast water will move through a pipe. We can predict where turbulence will form. We can design systems that control water flow with great precision. If Leonardo had asked a modern physics database about water, it would explain fluid dynamics, the equations that describe flow, and the principles that govern how liquids behave. It would show him simulations of water in motion, visualizations of flow patterns, and calculations of forces and pressures. This knowledge would have answered questions he spent years trying to understand through observation alone. Why do vortices form? How does water pressure change with depth? What determines the speed of flow? All of these have precise mathematical answers that would have amazed him. But he might also have appreciated that his observations were often correct, even if he could not explain them mathematically. The patterns he drew match what we calculate. His intuitive understanding captured real principles, even without the equations to describe them precisely. Leonardo's studies of water are beautiful because they capture motion and flow, but they are also scientifically valuable because they record careful observations of phenomena that would later be explained by physics. The understanding of materials in Leonardo's time was based on experience and tradition. Artists and craftspeople knew which materials worked well for which purposes. They learned through trial and error, passing knowledge down through apprenticeships. But they did not have a scientific understanding of why materials had the properties they did. Leonardo was interested in materials for his art and his engineering. He experimented with different paints, trying to find colors that would last. He studied how metals behaved when heated or hammered. He observed how wood grain affected strength, how stone could be carved or would fracture. He did not understand that material properties come from atomic structure. He did not know that metals are strong because of how their atoms bond together. He did not understand why some materials are flexible while others are brittle, why some conduct heat while others insulate. Modern material science has discovered the atomic and molecular basis of material properties. We understand how crystal structure affects strength. We know how to design materials with specific properties by controlling their composition and structure. We can create materials that did not exist in nature, like plastics and composites. If Leonardo had asked a modern material science database about the substances he worked with, it would explain their atomic structure, how they form, and why they have the properties they do. It would show him that the strength of steel comes from how iron and carbon atoms arrange themselves, that the transparency of glass comes from its molecular structure. This knowledge would have helped him understand why certain techniques worked. Why does heating and cooling steel make it stronger? Why does adding certain substances to paint change how it behaves? The answers lie in atomic and molecular interactions that he could not observe directly. But he might also have been inspired to experiment with new possibilities. Modern materials science has created substances with amazing properties. Materials that remember their shape, that change color with temperature, that are stronger than steel but lighter than aluminum. These would have seemed like magic to Leonardo, but they follow from understanding and controlling atomic structure. Leonardo's approach to materials was experimental and practical. He tried things and observed what happened. Modern materials science builds on this approach, but adds theoretical understanding and precise control that lets us design materials for specific purposes. The study of the human mind in Leonardo's time was mostly philosophical. People wondered about consciousness, about memory, about how the mind worked. But they did not have scientific tools to study the brain directly, to understand its structure and function. Leonardo was interested in the brain, though his understanding was limited. He dissected human brains and drew what he saw. He noticed that the brain had different regions, that it was connected to the body through nerves. But he could not see individual neurons, could not understand how signals traveled, could not explain how thoughts and memories formed. Modern neuroscience has tools that let us study the brain in detail. We can see individual neurons firing. We can map which brain regions are active during different tasks. We can understand how memories form, how emotions arise, how consciousness might emerge from neural activity. If Leonardo had asked a modern neuroscience database about the brain, it would explain neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters, and neural networks. It would describe how the brain processes information, how memories are stored, how different regions have specialized functions. This knowledge would have transformed his understanding of the portraits he painted. Those faces he captured so accurately are not just shapes and colors. They are expressions of neural activity, of emotions processed by specific brain circuits, of thoughts that emerge from billions of interconnected neurons. He might have realized that when he painted a smile, he was capturing something that emerges from complex brain processes. Emotions are not just feelings. They are patterns of neural activity, chemical signals, physiological changes, all working together. But he might also have struggled with the reductionist view that modern science sometimes takes. Can you really explain a feeling by describing neural circuits? Is consciousness just the sum of neural activity? Or is there something more? These are questions that neuroscience is still exploring, questions that Leonardo might have found fascinating. Leonardo's approach was to observe and record what he could see. Modern neuroscience extends observation far beyond what the unaided eye can perceive. But both approaches share a fundamental curiosity about how the mind works, about what makes us who we are. The understanding of time in Leonardo's time was based on natural cycles. People measured time by the sun, by the moon, by the seasons. Clocks existed, but weren't precise. The concept of deep time, of billions of years, didn't exist. Leonardo observed how things changed over time. He noticed how rivers carved valleys, how plants grew, how materials aged. He understood that the world wasn't static, that it changed slowly and constantly. But he couldn't measure these changes precisely, couldn't put numbers to the vast spans of time involved. Modern science has discovered that time operates on scales far beyond human experience. Astronomers using the Hubble Space Telescope have measured the universe's age at 13.8 billion years. Geologists using radiometric dating have determined the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago. Biologists studying DNA have found evidence that life has been evolving for over 3 billion years. These numbers are almost impossible to grasp, but they're based on measurements from instruments that didn't exist in Leonardo's time. If Leonardo had asked a modern science database about time, it would explain geological timescales, evolutionary time, cosmic time. It would describe how we measure these vast spans, how we reconstruct past events, how we can predict future changes. This knowledge would have given him new perspective on the landscapes he painted. Those mountains did not form quickly. They rose over millions of years. That river did not carve its valley in a human lifetime. It took thousands or millions of years of slow, patient erosion. He might have found beauty in these vast timescales, in the slow processes that shape the world. His paintings often show nature in a moment, frozen in time. But understanding the deep time behind those moments might have added another layer of meaning. Leonardo was interested in processes, in how things changed and moved. Modern science has revealed processes that operate on timescales far beyond what he could observe directly. But the curiosity, the desire to understand how things work, connects his observations to our scientific understanding. The study of energy in Leonardo's time was mostly about practical applications. People knew that moving water could turn wheels, that fire could heat things, that muscles could do work, but they didn't have a unified concept of energy, didn't understand how different forms of energy relate to each other. Leonardo observed energy in many forms. He saw how falling water could power mills. He understood that you needed to apply force to move things. He designed machines that converted one kind of motion into another. But he didn't have the concept of energy conservation, of energy transforming from one form to another. Modern physics has discovered that energy is fundamental to understanding how the universe works. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Physicists have measured this principle in countless experiments. Motion, heat, light, electricity, chemical bonds, all are forms of energy that can be converted into each other. When you eat food, your body converts chemical energy into motion. When you turn on a light, electrical energy becomes light and heat. These transformations follow precise mathematical laws that Leonardo couldn't have known. If Leonardo had asked a modern physics database about energy, it would explain the laws of thermodynamics, the relationship between energy and matter, the ways energy flows through systems. It would show him that every process, every change, involves energy transformation. This knowledge would have helped him understand why his machines worked or did not work. Why does a lever make it easier to lift something? It does not create energy. It transforms the energy you put in, changing force and distance. The total energy stays the same, but its form changes. He might have realized that all his observations of motion, of machines, of natural processes were really observations of energy in different forms. The flowing water, the turning wheel, the flying bird, all involve energy transforming from one state to another. Leonardo's machines were attempts to harness and control energy. Modern engineering does the same thing, but with a deep understanding of energy principles that lets us design systems far more efficient and powerful than anything he could have built. Before we dive deeper into how modern science would have changed Leonardo's understanding, let us pause for a moment in his world of knowledge. What tools did people actually have for learning and sharing information? How did scientific ideas spread or fail to spread in his time? In Leonardo's Italy, most scientific knowledge came from books, but books were expensive and rare. A single printed book might cost as much as a month's wages for a skilled worker. Only wealthy people, or people connected to universities or noble households, had access to large libraries. Leonardo himself probably had limited access to books. He was not university educated in the traditional sense. He would have learned from what he could borrow, buy, or hear from others. The printing press had been invented in the mid-1400s, just before Leonardo was born. According to historical records, Johannes Gutenberg printed his first Bible around 1455. It made books more common than they were before, but printing was still slow and labor-intensive. A printer might produce a few hundred copies of a book, and those copies would be sold over months or years. If a book didn't sell well, the printer might not make more. So even important scientific works might only reach a small audience. Historians studying book ownership in Renaissance Italy have found that most people owned very few books, if any. Research published in historical journals shows that wills and inventories from the period reveal a typical middle-class household might own a Bible, a prayer book, and maybe one or two other volumes. Only scholars, nobles, and wealthy merchants had substantial collections. The Medici family library in Florence, one of the largest in Europe at the time, contained about 10,000 volumes. Today, a single university library might hold millions of books. Scientific knowledge also spread through personal networks. Scholars wrote letters to each other, sharing observations and theories. They met in person when possible, visiting each other's homes or gathering at universities. These networks were slow and fragile. If a letter was lost, or if two scholars never met, their ideas might never connect. Some scientific knowledge came from practical experience. Craftspeople knew how to work with materials, even if they did not understand the underlying chemistry. Artists knew how to mix paints, even if they did not understand molecular interactions. Engineers knew how to build structures, even if they did not understand the physics of forces and stresses. This practical knowledge was often more reliable than the theoretical knowledge in books. A blacksmith might not have been able to explain metallurgy, but they knew how to heat and shape iron. A painter might not have understood optics, but they knew how to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. Archaeologists have found evidence of this practical knowledge in old workshops and studios. They discover tools, materials, and techniques that show sophisticated understanding, even when written records are scarce. Leonardo's notebooks themselves are evidence of this kind of knowledge, recorded in drawings and notes that preserve techniques and observations. If Leonardo had asked a modern science database about any scientific topic, the AI would draw from millions of modern sources. It would have access to peer-reviewed research, detailed textbooks, and vast databases. This would be like giving Leonardo access to every library in the world, updated in real time. The difference in scale is almost impossible to imagine, but there is something important to remember. Modern science builds on centuries of careful work. Each discovery depends on previous discoveries. Each tool depends on previous tools. You cannot jump directly from Leonardo's understanding to modern knowledge. You need all the steps in between. This is why a modern science database, trained on modern texts, might struggle to explain things in ways that Leonardo would understand. The database uses concepts and vocabulary that did not exist in his time. It assumes knowledge that had not been discovered yet. To truly help Leonardo, the database would need to build up from what he already knew, step by step, the way science actually developed. Now, shift from history to the inside of Leonardo's mind. How would his brain actually process all this new information? Neuroscientists talk about learning, memory, and cognitive load. The words sound complex, but the core ideas can be told simply. First, the brain does not store information the way a book does. It does not have pages you can flip through. Instead, it creates connections between neurons. When you learn something new connections form. When you remember something, those connections activate. The more you use a connection, the stronger it becomes. When Leonardo saw something new, his visual cortex processed the patterns of light. His memory systems compared these patterns to things he had seen before. His language areas tried to find words to describe what he was seeing. All of these regions worked together, creating a rich, multi-layered experience of understanding. If Leonardo suddenly had access to all of modern science, his brain would face an enormous challenge. Too much new information at once can overwhelm the system. The brain needs time to process, to connect new knowledge to old knowledge, to build understanding layer by layer. This is why learning works best when it builds gradually. You start with simple concepts. You practice them. You connect them to things you already know. Then, you add more complex ideas on top. Each layer supports the next, creating a stable structure of understanding. A modern science database might try to explain everything at once. It might show Leonardo quantum mechanics, general relativity, molecular biology, and astrophysics all in the same session. But his brain could not process all of that simultaneously. It would need to focus on one thing at a time, to build understanding piece by piece. This is one reason why Leonardo's approach of careful observation was so effective. He did not try to learn everything at once. He focused on one thing, studied it deeply, understood it as well as he could with the tools available. Then he moved on to the next thing. This slow, methodical approach let his brain build strong, stable connections. Modern science offers vast amounts of information, but the human brain still learns best through focused attention and gradual building. Even with access to all of modern knowledge, Leonardo would need to choose what to study, to focus his attention, to build understanding step by step. There is also the question of what Leonardo would actually do with all this new knowledge. Would he try to build modern machines? Would he create new art inspired by scientific concepts? Would he focus on understanding, on pure curiosity, without worrying about practical applications? Leonardo was both an artist and an engineer. He created beautiful paintings and designed practical machines. He studied anatomy to improve his art and to understand how the body worked. He observed nature, both for its beauty and for the principles it revealed. If he had access to modern science, he might have been drawn to different aspects. The visual nature of modern scientific imaging might have appealed to the artist in him. The precise calculations and equations might have challenged the engineer in him. The deep questions about the nature of reality might have fascinated the philosopher in him. But he would still be limited by the materials and tools of his time. He could learn about modern physics, but he could not build a particle accelerator. He could understand modern chemistry, but he could not create modern synthetic materials. He could study modern biology, but he could not use a microscope to see individual cells. This gap between knowledge and capability is important. Knowing how something works is different from being able to build it or use it. Leonardo might have understood principles that would not be applied for centuries, ideas ahead of their time, not because they were wrong, but because the technology to implement them did not exist yet. This is actually similar to what happened with some of Leonardo's own ideas. He designed flying machines, but the materials and engines needed to make them work did not exist in his time. He understood principles of flight that would later be proven correct, but he could not build a working aircraft. If he had modern scientific knowledge, he might have designed things that were even further ahead of their time, concepts that would not be realized for centuries. But he would still face the same fundamental limitation. Knowledge alone is not enough. You also need the tools and materials to turn knowledge into reality. Let us think about what Leonardo's notebooks would have looked like if he had access to modern science. His actual notebooks are filled with his own observations, his own drawings, his own questions. They are personal, immediate, a record of one mind engaging directly with the world. If he had a device that could show him modern scientific knowledge, Would his notebooks change? Would he still draw his own observations? Or would he copy diagrams from the screen? Would he still ask his own questions? Or would he focus on understanding answers that others had already found? There is something valuable about the process of discovery, about working through problems yourself, about making your own observations and drawing your own conclusions. This process builds understanding in a way that just reading answers cannot match. Leonardo's notebooks are valuable not just for what they contain, but for what they reveal about how he thought. You can see him working through problems, trying different approaches, making mistakes and correcting them. This process of thinking is itself a kind of knowledge, different from the facts he recorded. If he had instant access to modern scientific answers, he might have skipped some of this process. He might have looked up solutions instead of working through problems. His notebooks might have become more like reference collections, less like records of active thinking. But he might also have used modern knowledge as a starting point for new questions. Instead of spending time rediscovering what others already knew, he could have focused on new problems, on questions that modern science had not yet answered. His notebooks might have contained even more original thinking, building on a foundation of knowledge that would have taken him years to discover on his own. The relationship between existing knowledge and new discovery is complex. Too much focus on what is already known can stifle creativity. But too little knowledge can mean spending time rediscovering what others already understand. The ideal balance lets you build on what is known while still thinking independently. There is also the question of how modern science would have changed Leonardo's art. His paintings are famous for their realism, for their accurate representation of the human form, of light and shadow, of perspective. He achieved this through careful observation and study. If he had understood modern biology, would his anatomical drawings have been even more accurate? If he had understood modern physics, would his studies of light have been more precise? If he had understood modern chemistry, would his paint formulations have been more durable? Probably yes, in some ways. Modern science offers tools and knowledge that could improve almost any artistic technique. But art is not just about accuracy. It is also about expression, about capturing something beyond the purely factual. Leonardo's paintings are not just accurate representations. They also convey emotion, mood, meaning. The Mona Lisa's smile is not just a correct rendering of facial muscles. It is an expression that has fascinated viewers for centuries. Modern science might help an artist understand the mechanics of expression, the neural basis of emotion, the physics of how we perceive images, but it cannot tell an artist what to express, what meaning to convey, what emotional response to evoke. Leonardo might have used modern scientific knowledge to make his art more accurate, more technically perfect. But the artistic choices, the creative decisions, the expression of meaning would still come from him, from his unique perspective and vision. This is one way that art and science are different, even when they inform each other. Science can tell you how things work, what is true about the physical world. Art can express what those truths mean, how they feel, what they suggest about human experience. Leonardo was unusual in being both a scientist and an artist, in using observation to serve both understanding and expression. Modern science might have enhanced both aspects of his work, but it would not have replaced the creative vision that made his art unique. Let us also think about what Leonardo would have found most surprising in modern science. What discoveries would have challenged his understanding the most? What would have seemed impossible, magical, beyond belief? The scale of the universe might have been shocking. In Leonardo's time, people knew the Earth was large, but they did not understand how vast space really is. The idea that stars are distant suns, that galaxies contain billions of stars, that the universe is billions of light years across, would have been almost incomprehensible. The scale of the very small might have been equally shocking. The idea that matter is made of atoms, that atoms are mostly empty space, that there are particles smaller than atoms, would have challenged his understanding of what solid matter really is. The age of the Earth and the universe would have been surprising. In Leonardo's time, most people believed the Earth was only a few thousand years old, based on biblical calculations. The idea that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, that the universe is nearly 14 billion years old, would have been revolutionary. The idea that all life is related, that humans share ancestors with other animals, would have been controversial. In Leonardo's time, people saw humans as separate from and superior to the rest of nature. The concept of evolution, of common descent, would have challenged this view. The idea that the Earth moves, that it rotates and orbits the sun, would have been hard to accept. Leonardo's direct experience was of standing on solid, unmoving ground. The concept that this ground is actually moving through space at high speed would have felt impossible. But Leonardo was also a careful observer who trusted his eyes. If he had seen evidence for these ideas, if he had seen photographs from space, or images from microscopes, or data from experiments, he might have been more willing to accept them than someone who only read about them in books. His approach was to observe and question. If modern science offered new ways to observe, new evidence to consider, he might have been open to ideas that seemed impossible based on everyday experience alone. There is also the question of what modern science would have confirmed about Leonardo's own observations. What did he get right that science would later prove? What intuitions did he have that turned out to be correct? His anatomical drawings were remarkably accurate. Modern anatomy confirms the structures he drew, the relationships he observed. His understanding of how muscles attach to bones, how joints work, how organs are positioned, was largely correct. His observations about water flow match what we now calculate with fluid dynamics. The patterns he drew, the behaviors he described, correspond to the equations that govern how liquids move. His intuitive understanding captured real physical principles. His studies of light and shadow show understanding of principles we now explain with optics. The way he represented three-dimensional objects on two-dimensional surfaces follows geometric rules that are still used today. His observations about plant growth show patterns that we now explain with mathematical models. The way branches arrange themselves, the way leaves catch sunlight, follow principles of optimization that biology has discovered. His designs for machines show understanding of mechanical principles that are still valid. Levers, gears, pulleys work the way he understood them to work. His intuitive grasp of mechanical advantage was correct. Modern science would have confirmed that Leonardo was a careful, accurate observer. His methods of looking closely, recording what he saw, questioning assumptions were sound. Even without modern tools, he was able to discover real patterns in nature. This is important because it shows that careful observation, even with limited tools, can reveal truth. You do not need the most advanced instruments to learn about the world. You need curiosity, patience, and careful attention to what you can observe. Modern science offers powerful tools, but the fundamental approach of observing carefully, questioning assumptions, and building understanding gradually is timeless. Leonardo's methods were sound, even if his tools were limited. Before we let the story fade completely, let us circle back for a slower, deeper walk. This time we will look more closely at the real history and the real science hidden under the what if. The picture will stay calm and quiet. The details will just get a little sharper around the edges. In Leonardo's Italy, reading and writing were not common skills for everyone. Historians who study old records think that maybe 2 or 3 people out of 10 in cities like Florence could read at the time. In the countryside, the number was even lower. Books were still expensive objects. Paper cost money. Printing required metal type, presses, ink, and trained workers. The printing press itself had arrived in Italy around 1465, when Leonardo was a teenager. By his adulthood, printing had become more common, but it was still a relatively new technology. Most books were still copied by hand, a slow and expensive process. When we say that Leonardo's notebooks spread knowledge, we can point to what actually happened. His notebooks were not published during his lifetime. They remained private, passed down through his students, and eventually scattered across collections. It was only centuries later that scholars began to study them systematically, to understand what he had observed and discovered. Now imagine adding modern science into that historical record. If Leonardo could have accessed scientific knowledge instantly, his notebooks might have looked very different. They might have contained references to concepts that would not be discovered for centuries. They might have shown him working through problems with information from the future. But there is also a question of what would have been lost. Leonardo's actual notebooks show his process of discovery, his struggles, his mistakes, his gradual understanding. If he had instant answers, would he have still recorded his own thinking process? Would we have lost something valuable about how a curious mind works? There is also the question of words themselves. Modern science uses vocabulary that did not exist in Leonardo's time. Words like atom, molecule, electron, DNA, quantum, relativity, all came later. How would Leonardo have understood concepts that had no words in his language? He might have invented new terms or adapted old ones. He might have used metaphors and analogies to bridge the gap between what he knew and what he was learning. His notebooks might have become even more creative in their language, finding new ways to express new ideas. But language shapes thought. The words available limit what concepts can be easily expressed. Leonardo might have understood modern scientific ideas, but expressing them in the vocabulary of his time would have been a challenge. This is one way that knowledge and language are intertwined. New discoveries often require new words. New words enable new ways of thinking. The development of science and the development of language have always moved together. Let us also think about the material side of things. What would power our imaginary device in Leonardo's workshop? Modern computers and databases use huge amounts of electricity. Data centers consume significant energy. Training large language models or running complex simulations requires specialized hardware and power infrastructure. Of course, our story is fiction. There were no power plants in 1500 that could run modern computing systems. But thinking about this tension brings in another scientific field: energy systems and sustainability. Researchers now ask how to design more efficient computing systems, how to power them with renewable energy, how to make technology accessible without using unsustainable resources. These are questions that did not exist in Leonardo's time, but they are central to how we use modern science today. So in our quiet thought experiment, if Leonardo had access to modern science, there would also have to be an entire hidden stack of technologies behind it. Power generation, data storage, network infrastructure. Each of those pieces has its own story with engineers, inventors, and experiments. But we can imagine that Leonardo, with his fascination for machines and systems, might have been as interested in how the device worked as in what it could tell him. He might have wanted to understand the principles behind it, to see if he could build something similar, even if with the limited materials of his time. This curiosity about how things work, not just what they do, is part of what made Leonardo special. He did not just use tools, he studied them, understood them, improved them. If he had modern technology, he would probably have wanted to take it apart, to see how it functioned, to learn its principles. The scientific method, as we know it today, was just beginning to form in Leonardo's time. Modern science relies on careful observation, controlled experiments, and peer review. Scientists test hypotheses, collect data, and revise theories based on evidence. But in Leonardo's era, this approach was still new and not yet formalized. Most knowledge still came from authority. If an ancient Greek or Roman writer had said something, it was often accepted as true. If the Bible or a respected scholar made a claim, people tended to believe it. Questioning authority was risky. It could lead to accusations of heresy or disrespect. But some thinkers were starting to challenge this. They argued that you should test ideas yourself, not just trust what others said. You should observe nature directly, not just read about it in books. You should be willing to change your mind when evidence contradicted your beliefs. Leonardo was part of this shift. Though he did not write formal scientific papers, his approach was to observe, to draw, to question. He trusted what he could see with his own eyes more than what he read in books. This was a form of the scientific method, even if it was not yet formalized. If Leonardo had asked a modern science database about the scientific method, it would explain hypothesis testing, controlled experiments, statistical analysis, and peer review. It would describe how modern scientists design studies, collect data, and evaluate evidence. This systematic approach would have been revolutionary to someone in Leonardo's time. But modern scientists have also learned that the scientific method has limits. Not everything can be tested in a lab. Some questions require different approaches, and even the best experiments can be misinterpreted or lead to wrong conclusions. Science is always a work in progress, always open to revision. Leonardo's approach of careful observation is still valid, even if it is not the only way to do science. Sometimes the best way to learn is to look closely, to notice patterns, to question assumptions. Modern science has added powerful tools and methods, but the fundamental curiosity that drove Leonardo is still at the heart of scientific discovery. The understanding of time and space in Leonardo's era was very different from ours. People did not have precise clocks or standardized time zones. They measured time by the sun, by church bells, or by hourglasses. A day was divided into hours, but those hours varied in length depending on the season. Distance was also measured differently. People used units like miles, but a mile might mean different things in different places. Maps were rough and often inaccurate. Travel was slow and uncertain. A journey that takes hours today might have taken days or weeks in Leonardo's time. This affected how people thought about the world. Leonardo's observations were always from his own perspective, from a fixed point in space and time. The concept that space and time are relative, that they depend on the observer, would have challenged his direct experience. But he was also someone who understood that perspective matters, that how you look at something affects what you see. This understanding might have helped him accept that space and time themselves might be more complex than they appear. The study of the human body and mind in Leonardo's time was a mix of medicine, philosophy, and religion. People did not have a clear separation between physical and mental health. Emotions were thought to affect the body directly. A strong emotion could cause physical symptoms. A physical illness could affect your thoughts and feelings. This holistic view had some truth to it. Modern research on psychosomatic medicine and the mind-body connection shows that emotions do affect physical health, and physical health affects mental state. But the mechanisms are different than people in Leonardo's time imagined. The brain was not well understood. Most people thought the heart was the seat of emotions and intelligence. When Leonardo drew the human body, he showed the heart as central, both physically and symbolically. This was the common understanding of his time. But some anatomists were starting to study the brain more carefully. Leonardo himself dissected brains and drew what he saw. He noticed that the brain had different regions, that it was connected to the body through nerves. But he did not have the tools to study brain activity in living people. Modern neuroscientists use brain imaging, electrical recordings, and other advanced techniques to study how the brain works. They have discovered that different regions do have different functions, but the brain is also highly interconnected. Thoughts, emotions, and memories are distributed across many areas, not located in single spots. If Leonardo had asked a modern neuroscience database about the brain and mind, it would explain neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters, and neural networks. It would describe how memories are stored, how emotions are processed, how consciousness might emerge from brain activity. This knowledge would have transformed how people understood themselves and each other. But modern neuroscience has also confirmed some intuitions that people in Leonardo's time had. They were right that the mind and body are connected. They were right that emotions affect health. They were right that experience shapes who we become. They just did not understand the mechanisms. Leonardo's anatomical drawings showed deep insight into the structure of the human body. even without modern scientific knowledge. His observations about how muscles work, how joints move, how organs are positioned, were often accurate. His understanding of human anatomy was remarkable for his time, and much of it still holds up today. The materials and technologies available in Leonardo's time shaped what was possible. People worked with wood, stone, metal, glass, cloth, and leather. They had simple machines, levers, pulleys, wheels, gears. They could build impressive structures, but the tools and materials limited what they could create. Metallurgy, the science of working with metals, was well developed, but still based on trial and error. Blacksmiths knew how to heat and shape iron. They could make steel by adding carbon, though they did not understand the chemistry. They created tools, weapons, and building materials that were strong and durable. Archaeologists who study old metal objects have found that craftspeople in Leonardo's time were highly skilled. They could create complex shapes, join pieces together, and work with different alloys. But their knowledge was mostly practical, passed down through apprenticeships rather than written in books. Glassmaking was another advanced craft. Glass had been made for thousands of years, but techniques improved during Leonardo's era. Clear glass for windows became more common. Glass vessels for storing liquids were widely used, but making large, flat panes of glass was still difficult and expensive. If Leonardo had asked a modern materials science database about the substances he worked with, it would explain atomic structure, chemical bonds, crystal lattices, and material properties. It would describe how modern scientists design new materials with specific properties, how they understand why materials behave the way they do, how they can create substances that did not exist in nature. This knowledge would have seemed like magic to someone in Leonardo's time. But modern materials scientists have also learned from studying old techniques. Some traditional methods work well, even though people did not understand the science behind them. Ancient craftspeople discovered effective processes through experimentation, even without knowing why they worked. Leonardo's approach was similar. He experimented with materials, tried different techniques, observed what worked. He might not have understood the underlying chemistry, but he learned through practice what would achieve the results he wanted. This experimental approach is still valuable, even when we also have theoretical understanding. The understanding of energy and motion in Leonardo's time was mostly based on observation and common sense. People knew that moving objects could do work. They used water wheels to grind grain, wind to power ships, and muscle power for most tasks. But they did not have a unified theory of energy. The concept of energy conservation, that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed, was still centuries away. People did not understand the relationship between heat and motion, or between different forms of energy. They knew that fire produced heat, but they did not understand that heat was a form of energy that could be converted into motion. Some thinkers were starting to study motion more carefully. They observed how objects fell, how projectiles moved, how pendulums swung. They tried to find mathematical patterns in these movements, but their tools for measurement were limited, and their theories were still incomplete. Leonardo studied motion extensively. His notebooks are full of sketches of mechanisms, of ways to convert one kind of motion into another. He understood that you could use gears to change speed and direction. He understood that you could use pulleys to multiply force. He observed patterns in how things moved, even if he could not explain them with precise equations. If Leonardo had asked a modern physics database about energy and motion, it would explain kinetic energy, potential energy, thermodynamics, and quantum mechanics. It would describe how energy transforms between different forms, how motion relates to force and mass, how the laws of physics govern everything from atoms to galaxies. This unified understanding would have been revolutionary. But modern physicists have also discovered that some intuitive ideas from Leonardo's time were partly right. People understood that moving objects had power. They understood that natural forces could be harnessed. They just did not have the mathematical framework to describe these relationships precisely. Leonardo's observations captured real patterns in motion, even if he could not express them mathematically. His designs for machines show understanding of energy principles, even if he did not have the concept of energy itself. His intuitive grasp of how things move was sound, even without the equations to describe it precisely. As we come to the end of this sleepy journey, picture Leonardo once more in his workshop. The candles have burned low. Wax pools at their bases. The streets outside are quieter now. The mysterious glowing screen has dimmed, its knowledge absorbed for the night. On the table lies a notebook filled with new sketches. Some ideas came from the modern science he just learned. Some came from his own restless curiosity. But together, they became something neither could have made alone. A new pattern, another small gift to whoever might study it. You have similar notebooks inside you, waiting. Memories, questions, half-formed ideas. Tools like modern science can help you explore them, but they are not the source. You are. Your experiences, your observations, your unique way of seeing the world. Physicists studying Leonardo's designs for flying machines have found something interesting. When they analyze his sketches using modern aerodynamics, they discover that some of his ideas were actually correct. His understanding of how air flows over curved surfaces matches principles we now use in aircraft design. Other ideas wouldn't have worked, but they show he was thinking about the right problems. Engineers have built working models of some of Leonardo's machines. They found that his designs for gears, pulleys, and levers work exactly as he intended. His understanding of mechanical advantage was sound. His designs for bridges show he understood how to distribute weight. These physical tests confirm that Leonardo wasn't just dreaming. He was solving real engineering problems with the tools and knowledge available to him. If Leonardo had access to modern engineering software, he could have tested his designs before building them. He could have seen how forces would distribute through a structure. He could have calculated whether a design would work or fail. This would have saved him time and materials, but it also might have limited his creativity. Sometimes the best discoveries come from trying things that shouldn't work, but do. Modern scientists face a similar challenge. They have powerful tools for simulation and calculation, but they still need to test their ideas in the real world. A computer model might say something should work, but reality has a way of surprising you. Leonardo understood this. He knew that the final test of any idea is whether it works when you actually build it. There is also a quiet beauty in how knowledge accumulates over time. A single person cannot discover everything, but each person can add their observations, their questions, their insights. Over centuries, these contributions build into something larger than any individual could create alone. Leonardo's notebooks are valuable because they record one person's careful observations. Modern science is valuable because it combines observations from millions of people, tested and refined over time. Both approaches have value. Both contribute to understanding. When you learn something new, you are not just receiving information. You are joining a conversation that has been going on for thousands of years. You are adding your own perspective, your own questions, your own way of understanding. This is one way that knowledge is different from information. Information can be stored and transmitted. Knowledge is built through engagement, through questioning, through making connections. It is alive, always growing, always changing. Leonardo's approach of careful observation is still valid today. Even with all of modern science available, there is still value in looking closely, in noticing details, in asking your own questions. The tools have changed, but the curiosity that drives discovery remains the same. There is also the question of what gets lost when knowledge comes too easily. When answers are instantly available, do we still learn to ask good questions? When information is abundant, do we still value the process of discovery? Leonardo's notebooks show the value of struggle, of working through problems, of making mistakes and learning from them. This process builds understanding in a way that just reading answers cannot match. It creates connections in the brain that make knowledge more durable, more useful. Modern science offers vast amounts of information, but the process of learning still matters. You still need to engage with ideas, to question them, to connect them to what you already know. The tools can help, but they cannot replace the work of understanding. This is one reason why Leonardo's approach of careful observation is still valuable. Even with access to modern science, there is still something to be learned from looking closely, from noticing patterns, from asking your own questions. The process of discovery teaches you how to think, not just what to know. When you put all of this together, the picture of Leonardo plus modern science becomes less like a simple thought experiment and more like a doorway. On the other side of that doorway are many fields: history of science, cognitive psychology, philosophy of knowledge, art and creativity, the relationship between tools and understanding. Each field has its own methods and its own kinds of evidence. Historians study old notebooks and documents to understand how people thought. Psychologists study how brains learn and remember. Philosophers ask what knowledge is and how we can know anything. Artists explore how observation and creativity interact. Together, these different perspectives give shape to the story. They help us understand not just what Leonardo knew, but how he knew it and what difference modern tools might have made. The materials and technologies available in Leonardo's time shaped what was possible, but they also shaped what questions could be asked. When your tools are limited, you focus on what you can observe directly. When your tools expand, new questions become possible. Modern science has tools that extend human senses in ways Leonardo could not have imagined. But those tools also create new limitations. They require training to use. They can be expensive. They can create distance between the observer and what is being observed. Leonardo's approach of direct observation had its own advantages. It was immediate, personal, grounded in experience. It let him see connections that might be missed when using complex instruments. It kept him close to the phenomena he was studying. Both approaches have value. Modern science needs both the precision of instruments and the insight of careful observation. The best science combines tools that extend our senses with the curiosity and attention that make observation meaningful. In reality, what Leonardo did have were his eyes, his hands, his curiosity, and his notebooks. These were powerful tools. They let him observe, record, question, and create. They let him build understanding, one observation at a time. When you learn something new, you are using similar tools. Your eyes to see, your mind to question, your memory to connect new ideas to old ones, your curiosity to drive you forward. Modern science can provide information, but it cannot provide understanding. Understanding comes from engagement, from questioning, from making connections. It comes from the same process Leonardo used: observe, question, learn, create. Archaeologists have studied Leonardo's actual workshop sites in Milan and Florence. They found evidence of his working methods: charcoal from his drawings, pigments from his paints, tools for measuring and cutting. These physical remains tell us about the materials he had available, the techniques he used, the limitations he worked within. Modern material scientists have analyzed the paints Leonardo used. They found that he experimented with different binders, different pigments, different techniques. Some of his experiments worked, others didn't. But he kept trying, kept observing, kept learning. This experimental approach is still used by scientists today. If Leonardo had access to modern chemistry, he would have understood why some of his paint experiments worked and others didn't. He would have known about molecular structure, about how different compounds interact, about how to create more stable pigments. But he might also have appreciated that his experimental method, his willingness to try and observe, was itself valuable. Historians have also studied how Leonardo's ideas spread after his death. Some of his designs were published in books. Others remained in private collections. Some were lost entirely. It took centuries for scholars to fully appreciate the scope of his work. Today, with digital technology, we can scan and share his notebooks instantly, making them available to anyone with an internet connection. This raises an interesting question. If Leonardo had access to modern communication tools, how would his ideas have spread? Would he have shared his notebooks online? Would he have collaborated with scientists around the world? Would his observations have reached more people faster? We can't know for sure, but we can see that modern science benefits from rapid communication. A discovery made in one lab can be shared with researchers around the world in minutes. Ideas can be tested, refined, and built upon much faster than in Leonardo's time. This acceleration of knowledge is one of the biggest differences between his era and ours. But the fundamental process hasn't changed. Scientists still observe carefully. They still question assumptions. They still test ideas. They still build understanding step by step. These are the same skills Leonardo used. The tools have changed, but the method remains the same. Biologists studying Leonardo's anatomical drawings have made some surprising discoveries. When they compare his drawings to modern medical imaging, they find that he got many details right. His drawing of the human heart shows the 4 chambers correctly. His studies of muscles show the attachment points accurately. His observations about how joints work match what we see in X-rays and MRIs. But he also made mistakes. Some structures he drew don't exist. Others he placed in the wrong location. These errors tell us something important. They show that Leonardo was working from observation alone, without the benefit of centuries of accumulated knowledge. He was discovering things for himself, sometimes getting them right, sometimes getting them wrong. If Leonardo had access to modern anatomy textbooks, he would have seen these errors corrected. He would have learned from the work of thousands of anatomists who came after him. He would have had access to detailed descriptions, accurate diagrams, and explanations of how each part functions. But he might also have appreciated that his method of direct observation was valuable. Modern medical students still dissect cadavers. They still learn by seeing and touching. Textbooks are helpful, but there's something important about direct experience. Leonardo understood this. He knew that seeing something yourself is different from reading about it. This is one reason why his notebooks are still studied today. They're not just historical curiosities. They're records of a careful observer working through problems, making discoveries, sometimes making mistakes, but always learning. This process of learning through observation and questioning is still at the heart of science. Modern scientists use the same approach, but with better tools. They observe with telescopes that see billions of light years away. They observe with microscopes that see individual atoms. They observe with particle detectors that see things smaller than atoms. But the fundamental act of careful observation, of questioning what you see, of building understanding step by step, that hasn't changed. Leonardo would have recognized this process. He would have understood what modern scientists are doing, even if he couldn't understand all the details of what they're discovering. The method would have been familiar to him. The tools would have been amazing, but the curiosity, the drive to understand, the careful observation, these would have felt like home. Historians have studied what happened to Leonardo's notebooks after his death. According to research published in art history journals, his notebooks were scattered across Europe. Some were lost, others were collected by wealthy patrons. Today, about 6,000 pages survive in museums and private collections around the world. The largest collection is in the Royal Library at Windsor Castle, which holds over 1,200 pages. These surviving pages show Leonardo's method of observation. He didn't just draw what he saw. He questioned it. He tested it. He compared it to other things he had observed. This method of careful observation and questioning is still used by scientists today. If Leonardo had access to modern science, he would have seen how this method has been refined and expanded. Scientists today use the same basic approach: observe carefully, question assumptions, test ideas, and build understanding step by step. But they also have tools that extend observation far beyond what the human eye can see. Modern telescopes can see objects billions of light years away. Electron microscopes can see individual atoms. Particle accelerators can probe the structure of matter itself. Each new tool opens new questions, new observations, new understanding. Leonardo's notebooks show he was always asking questions. What makes water flow? How do birds fly? How does the human body work? These are the same kinds of questions scientists ask today. The difference is that modern scientists have tools to answer them in ways Leonardo never could. But the curiosity, the willingness to question, the careful observation, these haven't changed. They're still at the heart of how science works. Whether you're looking at a bird in flight with your eyes or studying its aerodynamics with a computer simulation, the process starts with the same thing: curiosity about how the world works. Leonardo's legacy isn't just in his paintings or his inventions. It's in his method of observation, his willingness to question, his drive to understand. These are the same qualities that drive modern science forward, and they're the same qualities that would have made him fascinated by all the discoveries science has made since his time. So picture Leonardo one more time, in his workshop, with that strange glowing screen. He's not just receiving information, he's comparing it to everything he already knows. He's asking new questions, he's making new connections, he's doing what he always did: observing, questioning, learning, creating. The screen goes dark, the candle flickers. The workshop fills with the quiet work of a curious mind, trying to understand a universe that's far more complex and wonderful than anyone in his time could have imagined. Good night.